G'day, welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to do a video on wind in an ELR shot, or where is the most important wind in an ELR or ULR, so extreme long range or ultra long range shot. Now I suppose it'll be a quick recap. Wind, yes, wind affects a bullet's trajectory, and in normal shooting, the most important, so normal shooting being normal distance, be it 100 yards out to probably 1,000 yards, the most important wind is the wind closest to the shooter. As you get further out, your mid-range wind and your long-range wind has more effect. And this is through the nature that even though you would think it's a little bit the opposite, because a bullet is traveling fastest closest to the shooter, so it should be affected the least, and so it's slowest out at target, so it would be affected more. The thing is, a small change to the trajectory at the beginning of the bullet's flight makes a big change at the end. Just like MOA, just like group size, all that sort of stuff, it opens up. So at the beginning, a tiny shift at the beginning affects a lot more at the end than a tiny shift at the end, which is just a tiny shift at the end. So that sort of stuff, and there is scales that go with this. I think out to 200 meters or 200 yards, there's 60% of the or more is on the first third of the shot is the importance, and when you get out to like 1,000 meters or 1,000 yards, that neck of the woods, then it's back down to 40% at the first, and then 25% in the middle, and 15% at the end, or something like that. Percentages, but largely the beginning of the shot is the most important thing. And as you get further and further, the mid-range becomes more important, and a little bit at the target side of things, but it's only the last little bit, so it only is much more a one-to-one sort of change of things out at target. So all that said, there is videos on that go through just wind, and I'll put up some charts there to basically go through that. But this video is about extreme long range shooting or ultra long range shooting. And there is a fundamental difference that moves into this sort of shooting, where the most important wind is actually in the middle of your shot. And that's because it's actually the wind that affects a extreme long range shot the most is your upper level wind, is your higher wind. Most people would be aware that we have ground winds, and then we have mid-range winds, and then we have the high level, which can move into slipstream winds. And there can be more layers, but that's the basic stuff. If you go outside and on a stormy day, you can look up sometimes and see clouds traveling in different directions. High clouds are traveling one way, and mid-range clouds are traveling another way. And like I said, sometimes even more than that. But that is the nature of, yes, there are different winds. And to the largest degree, there is 3 different zones of air, which is definitely the ground stuff, is definitely affected by all the terrain and the bits and pieces around here. That also, then there's a mid-range wind, which is more what we see at the tops of the trees or going over the tops of the hills and that sort of stuff, which is generally faster still, and that certainly is also influenced a little bit by the terrain, but it's influenced by the general trend of the barometric pressures and things that are around the place. And then slipstream winds are another level of wind which are more affected by the planet and the winds that are going on there. I'm not going to go into the full Bureau of Meteorology explanation of this sort of stuff, the scientific explanation, but those are the winds. Now, to understand another little detail of this is that those winds aren't at set levels. They, with pressures, and just like fluid bodies, they will move at different rates to each other. So there'll be sort of a wave form or various things that are going on to do with terrain once again, but also to do with the nature of how fluids travel alongside each other. They don't have a nice shiny surface, which makes the levels definitely set. They move around a little bit. And certainly in places like where we shoot, over a hilly area, so we're on a hill, we shoot to another hill, so there's valleys and bucks and wriggles in the terrain. Well, the wind's doing the same thing. On some days we'll see that mid-range wind come down lower and really rubs on us and we see it more, and other times it's out of our face and it's not really affecting us too much. But the nature of an extreme long range shot or an ultra long range shot is that the arc of the bullet and how high the flight path the bullet goes, or the travel path of the bullet goes, is that it actually goes up into the mid-range and maybe even higher. for those that don't understand, is a very simple way to work out your approximate maximum height of the trajectory of the projectile. That is a simple thing of as you work out a group, or as you work out a size, when you're ranging, all that sort of stuff, in the simple bits. If you've got 1,000, or let's say a 3,000 yard shot, and we take, it would be small for that shot, but let's say we've just got 100 MOA of dialing in. 100 MOA means that our barrel is pointing 100 MOA above the target when we actually are aiming at the target. At 3,000 yards, 100 MOA above target is 3,000 inches. Now that isn't how high the bullet travels, but roughly the rough maths on it is that approximately 2/3 the way to the target that will be the peak of your shot, and that will be around 1/3 of the maximum MOA is where you're going to end up with. So it's not quite, the numbers aren't quite there, but about 1/3 is the maximum trajectory of the projectile. And 1/3 is 1,000 inches. So you look at that, if it's 200 MOA in that same thing, then it would be 2,000 inches is how far we've gone. So that's approximately what you're looking at, which is a lot. Yes, we're talking about a lot. Now this can be worked out in mil and all those bits and pieces, but if you remember the 1/3 of your actual where your barrel's pointing, or of what would be called bullet drop, all that side of things, if that bullet travelled dead straight versus it dropping to target, 1/3 of that drop is what your actual peak trajectory of that is, and that is how high your bullet is travelling into the air. So as you can imagine, it goes into wind that you simply can't see, and that's the biggest key I'm actually moving into here. That is the most important wind. That is from how, once it goes into that higher level of wind, how long it's up there. It's a little bit of how long's a piece of string. Not only is it hard to predict exactly where that wind changes its speed, but it also is not necessarily going to be at a constant thing. In some cases, when there's more of a dip through your shot, the bullet is going to travel through that higher wind speed for longer, and some cases it's going to travel for whether it's going the other way, the dip's up, where the bullet travels through that higher wind speed for shorter, for less time. So now how do you do that, you say? How do you work that out? Well, in some cases it's the big difference between shooting at 1,000 yards or 1,200 yards, and it's really easy, and then I'm now shooting at 1,500 yards or 1,700 yards or meters, however you want it, whatever unit you're using, and all of a sudden it's impossible. My bullet must be losing stability. It's impossible. I can't do it. I can't understand it. Well, in some cases that's exactly what you're talking about. You've moved into a different wind stream that you can't see, and that's a little more irregular up there. In other cases, well, and I suppose where I'd go through how you actually work this out for long range shooting, and the best way to do this without question is you read your weather report. You use the Bureau of Meteorology, use the scientists and with the equipment that are measuring this. This wind up here is actually more predictable than our ground wind. And it is driven in a sense where they largely can figure that out. And it's a very important ingredient. Knowing your local terrain, that's very important, or understanding terrain, understanding the more you do of this sort of stuff, the more you can see. You know what your weather report is, you know what your ground winds are doing, and you start to see what's actually happening. Certainly local knowledge, or at least some time in the area to figure out what that wind's doing and actually start to see it, especially when you've got hills involved. There's easier to see what's going on or start to understand it. It certainly complicates the issue, but this can also be something you run into even in a plain area where you'll still have different wind zones. As to whether you're going into them or not in those different levels depends on your shot and the trajectory of the shot. But certainly the key, the biggest thing you can do, or there's probably three things I'd say. One is your weather report and some knowledge to go with that weather report. So you're sort of used to the fact that they're about right, you understand it. Certainly knowledge of your local terrain and how those winds are affected with it. So you know when it's coming from the south-southeast or the southwest or whatever it is, it goes across these hills and it'll tend to be doing this. That's something that's really valuable to know, and it's certainly one of the keys I use. And the last bit is, it's probably, some people would say it's just holding your mouth in the right angle. You really do get the feeling, or I really do see sometimes, what looks like it's walking a bullet in onto target is actually understanding what's going on in the cycles of the wind. There is definitely situations where I've been where it just seems grey areaed and it's 5 shots or it's 6 shots or it's 10 shots that until I start to actually see what's happening with the wind. And you can't use your wind flag at target, you can't use the wind you feel. You've actually got to use, I don't know, whether this is holding your mouth in the right angle. I tend to find that after a little bit, I can start to see it, and then I'll start to be on target or just rubbing the edge on the target at 2 miles on my 24-inch plate. And it's actually, I've actually got a grip on what's actually happening. And I suppose, to be completely truthful, then I stop finding the words to explain how that is. I can actually start to see it. And I've certainly heard from other shooters that that's part of what will happen when you start to read those conditions. I think there's a level of intuition. I think there's a level of certainly working out your shots and working out the groups and working out that area, but you start to get a feel for where things are going. So listen, I'm not trying to say it's black magic involved with this. It is complicated, but those are the details that are most important. Your bureau, it's knowing what the weather report is, knowing where that wind's going to be traveling, and then understand the terrain around it, and then using everything you can to tie those clues together and make sense of what the wind's doing with the wind you do know, the wind you can see, the wind on the ground and the wind at shooter or in the trees around the place, and start to get a feel for what's going on. And for those that say put multiple wind flags out there, no, all the wind flags in the middle have literally nothing to do with what's happening up here. And maybe you could have a drone up there with a flag or something like that. It's not something that's realistic, and it's not something that I've ever tried to go down that road at all. I suppose that's the big key. What I'm actually saying, what this whole video is about, is the question to what is the most important wind on an ELR shot, or once you've stepped out into ELR territory and beyond. It's the wind up there, and that's in the middle third of your shot, which then breaks the rules from all the previous knowledge of normal long range shooting, which is the first third is most important, the second third is second most important, the last third is of least importance. Well, this breaks the rules. It puts that middle third into the most important. Anyway, guys, I hope that is a little bit enlightening. I hope there's a little bit of a clue in there for you. Thank you very much for checking in, and we'll catch you next time.